Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed our walkthroughs earlier today. My name is Xiaomin and I'm the creator of live programs at Leck Fell. I would like to welcome you to Caves, Developings and Vibration, a 2-day program deepening and complexifying our relationship with caves through a sensorial exchange across research, meditation, and performance. Caves, Developings and Vibration highlights Nottingham's extraordinary condition as a city built on the Caves network, the UK's largest network over 800 hidden beneath us. That goes back about 1,000 years. A secret city lies underneath us. Caves, Developings and Vibration then aspires to look closely into the poetic and artistic knowledge and wisdom caves carry, to think about the notions of geologic and deep time, archaeoacoustics, and the use of caves as spaces of dwellings, but also as spaces of upheaval. As you know, quite often we reach for geological or architectural terms to make sense of caves. This program tries to reach for an alternative vocabulary, a possibility that blurs the lines between the geological and architectural, the body and the intellect, to provide a haptic space for the felt, seen, and heard. As an extension of our current research trend, emergency and emergence, which investigates transdisciplinary, sensorial, and speculative practices of radical sense-making, this program aims to think about vibration as a meandering, a potential course of ongoing dominant knowledges and modes of being. Today you're going to partake in the offerings, incantations, and invocations from Flora Parrott, Frank Pearson, Catherine Yusuf, Andy Guffey, Francis Morgan, and in the evening we're going to descend into caves that our gallery sits above to experience further offerings, performances by Evan Feixia and Maxwell Sterling. Tomorrow we will convene again for further insights and offerings from Lara Emsley, Maria Angelico Madero, Emma McCormick Goodhart, Jessica Kenny, Ella Feiner, Louis Henderson, Zainab Bluth, Sarah Shin, and Susanna Davis Cook of Inauthenticity, and in the evening, and at the City of Caves from Lucy Railton and Paul Pergas. Some very brief housekeeping notes before I introduce our next guest. Although we will keep an informal atmosphere throughout the evening, our talks, performances, and screenings seek to create challenging environments where open-mindedness and respect for each other's approaches and perspectives can foster growth. So please be mindful and respectful of each other's opinions and views. In the unlikely case of emergency, a member of staff will guide you to the nearest fire exit. You will see that our toilets are located on the right-hand side when you exit. So please feel free to come and go as you please, but of course, as quiet as possible so that our events are not disrupted. I would like to use this opportunity to extend our thanks to our funders, the University of Nottingham and Nottingham Trent University, for generously and graciously supporting today's event, as well as my colleagues, Philippa Douglas, for her hard work leading up to this event, Shannon Charlesworth for her generosity of being back with us again, Catherine Masters for her meticulous organization, Sam Harrison for his detailed insights, Andy Batson for his careful support, and our tech team, Jim Brower, Craig Parr, Tom Harris, Tom Chamberlain, Paul Butter, and our company students, Holly, Jordan, and Laura. Thank you for making this program possible. Lastly, as with all events here at Nottingham Contemporary, this program is free to attend, but all donations are greatly appreciated to help support future programs. So without further delay, I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers, Flora Parrott, one of our exhibiting artists in our exhibition Hollow Earth, and Frank Pearson, with whom Flora has been spelunking together and thinking of ways in which one can describe the experience of being underground. Flora Parrott is an artist working in sculpture and textiles. She trained in printmaking at the Glasgow School of Art and the Royal College of Art. Her work explores subterranean spaces, deep darkness, and everyday geology. Recent projects include Race of Decay, Quench Gallery in Margate, and I am in the bath on all fours, a project made in collaboration with South African writer Lindiwe Mashikiza, recently shown at Eastside Project in Birmingham as part of Sonia Voices in the Castle of My Skin, and Nima Middlesbrough in 2021. Parrott has exhibited nationally and internationally, and she is a postdoctoral researcher on the European Research Council funded project Think Deep, based in Geography Department at Royal Holloway University of London, through which Flora is working very closely with Frank. Frank Pearson has climbed mountains and descended caves in various parts of the world for nearly 50 years. He is a member of the Mulu Caves, project which aims to explore and survey caves of Mulu National Park in Borneo. He searches for and explores caves in the Yorkshire Dales National Park and is the northern correspondent for Descent, a magazine of the underground exploration, and for the British Cave Research Association annual conference, Hidden Earth. His PhD was a research into the development of cave exploration and subterranean consciousness through travel writing, poetry, prose fiction, philosophy, and geology and chemistry between 1680 and 1830. Though retired from teaching, he still gives lectures and writes on cave exploration, the history of science, romantic literature, classic Chinese landscape poetry, and painting. He also works part-time as a research assistant and editor and writes poetry. Flora and Frank are going to talk about for an hour to touch upon their long-lasting collaboration. And once their conversation is over, we want to hear from you. So this event is being recorded, so for us to be able to record your questions, it's important for you to wait for the microphone to be handed to you. Please lift your hand up and wait for the mic to be brought over to you by one of our video assistants. So without further ado, over to you, dear Frank and Flora. Thank you.
Introduction, and thanks very much for having us, everybody. It's really fantastic to be here, and I'm so looking forward to the programme over the whole weekend. Frank and I are going to discuss a number of sites that we've either visited together, or that Frank has looked at, has visited or explored independently and spoken to me about, and those descriptions have really inspired recent work and also the kind of engagement with caves in the works in the show in the exhibition here. What you're looking at is a picture of a place called Leck Fell, an open moorland in Lancashire. Soon we're going to descend below Leck Fell into the cave networks underneath. This is one of the kind of first networks of caves that Frank and I will discuss. But before we do that, I just want to tell you about how Frank and I first met and why our conversations have been so important to me and the development of my artwork. In 2017, I attended a conference at the Royal Geographical Society celebrating the past 50 years of British caving. I was already interested in caves and had recently finished a project exploring caves in the Mendips using a fiberglass artificial cave to discuss kind of lostness and the sense of moving through these cave-like spaces. I'll show some of those slides later on, but that was the kind of point I'd reached when I went to this conference. There were many, many presentations over a couple of days, 2 or 3 days? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Frank's presentation immediately stood out to me. I was really struck by the fact that he addressed the unexplored caves of Britain, of which there are many, and the compulsion to continue to go back underground, the draw of these spaces. During that conference, there were lots and lots of incredible talks about the geology of the cave networks and discovering and mapping, but Frank seemed to talk about the poetics of these spaces and why they are so, why he feels so compelled to go into them. Frank uses multiple literary references in his talks, particularly from the Romantic period, and I was really struck with the fact that the whole presentation seemed to focus on what we do not know rather than what we do. So I wrote to Frank soon after that and was invited to go and spend the day in Lancashire caving with him and his group of diggers, who are a really fantastic group of people, and Frank will tell you more about them. Frank describes them all as space miners, which I really love. And when I first met the group, and the second time, the same joke was told me, which is that we're a drinking club with a digging problem. So I think that joke's come out every time I've met the group, but it's still pretty good. And then since then, we've sort of been corresponding by email and on Teams and in various ways. And then in October, I visited once again the Lake District, this time with my young son, who is 3, to explore the caves with Frank and his friends. So we're going to talk about our various conversations, but we're going to start with Leck Fell. In recent months, there's been a magnificent discovery. When did you discover that?
Over the last year and into 2001, 2021.
So there's been a new kind of discovery, which Frank has written 2 articles about. That's the name of the shape. What is the name of the article?
Fing Hopeless.
Fing Hopeless. The Shape of Emptiness is an article written across 2 parts in Descent magazine, and it's about this new space which I have not visited. But maybe Frank, you can sort of tell us a little bit about this new site under Leck Fell that you've been working with.
Yes. Okay. I've got to stand up. I think better on my feet. Leck Fell is here. Leck Fell's in Lancashire, and it's in the middle of what's called the 3 counties system in the Yorkshire Dales. So on the far side, just off shot here, is Cumbria. This part is Lancashire, and just off the shot is Yorkshire. The biggest cave system in Britain runs from Cumbria under Lancashire and comes out in Yorkshire. So it's called, unsurprisingly, the 3 counties system. And it's around about 90 kilometres long. That's obviously not in a single line. It's only a few kilometres across, but the cave is on different levels. So it's in a bed of very deep limestone, and it's one through glaciation and previous events has created an incredible network of cave systems. And so one of the things that myself and my colleagues try and do is find new cave. So we dig, and we dig holes in the ground. I had a tour before, and we were talking about miners. I mean, for me, when we go mining, we are digging, and we do tunnel, and we create scaffolding structures to keep ourselves safe. But in looking at the mines, of course, we're not looking for coal, we're not looking for tin, we're not looking for precious metals, we're looking for an opening. You know, we're looking for space. And just space enough to get in. If it's bigger, great. If not, we still try and get in. So I named the group the Space Miners. All we were looking for was space. And this idea of moving into the underground was something that we were all devoted to. We couldn't stop. And so dig after dig. Some don't work, some we give up. But others, like this one, we just kept pushing. You've got a feeling that something is going to open up. We could have to dig down through glacial boulder clay, maybe 20 meters. And the shafts would have to be lined with scaffolding. As we construct, with my friends here, construction engineers, we construct a safe passage through the boulder clay to where we hope the cave system opens up. Britain's only a small country, a small island. If you see it from space at night, there are lights everywhere. But if you look for the small sections where there are no lights, in many of those cases, there's limestone. And where there's limestone, there are caves, and there's space beneath your feet. And this is one of them.
That's the scaffolding holes there.
Yeah.
And this is going into...
Going into Hopeless, yeah. We give the caves names. And this one, at the time, the pandemic had been raging for some while, and the Prime Minister had just called the Health Secretary effing hopeless. So we were thinking, well, we're going into the underground. Dante, you know, abandon hope, all ye who enter. And we always think of the reverse psychology. We're not going to find anything. We've had to pack it up and go. So we just brought in this term. Instead of calling it the full term, we just called it Fing Hopeless. So it became Fing Hopeless Cave. We started with little hope, just a long shot, and it turned out to be one of the most stunning and beautiful things we've found. So at the moment, it's probably one of the greatest discoveries of recent years in the Yorkshire Dales. An absolute stunner of a cave. And it's one of those moments of wonder when you think the world is so crisscrossed with cars, roads, motorways, trains, and all of the stratification of urbanity, but still there is the unknown and the beauty of the unknown waiting beneath those feet.
We've got a few pictures of these new formations that have recently been discovered.
Yeah.
And this is one of the cave club members, Lian, looking at one of the newly discovered formations here. This is a really small one. But this is the really extraordinary space that you've just found up there, isn't it?
Yeah.
This space here. I wanted to ask you, Frank, there's a section of one of the articles you've written that discusses the kind of aesthetics of these caves. I was particularly struck by the notion that perhaps some of these formations are particularly extraordinary to look at because you've had such a struggle to get to them.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can speak a little bit about that, whether that's something you think is true.
Yeah. I think, again, many of you will have been into show caves where you go through a large gate and you go along a path and you have a guide and you see wonderful things. And I've been to many, many, many show caves, and they're very impressive, massive ones. But there is a difference, I feel, when you have to struggle to get into the cave to see what you're going to find. When we came to this, for example, this is just one tiny fraction of enormous cave passages. And you come at it, never had light on it, ever. No light has ever shone on that until we arrived, crawled through the space. We dropped down pitch after pitch, squeeze after squeeze. We've been lying in the stream, crawling along the stream bed, and bang, the first light. Part of me feels bad, this light pollution, suddenly, it had been dark since the beginning of time. It had never seen light. So this idea of deep time, and this idea of darkness, this thing of darkness, always struck me as an amazing moment. The spatial philosopher, Edward Casey, he talks about when you move from a familiar location into one that is radically unfamiliar. And he refers to the concept of dislocation. He doesn't talk about caves, but for me, that idea of dislocation was perfect with this kind of space. But this wasn't familiar. You were in a different spatial experience. Excuse me. Your body had taken you into that experience, and your imagination was exploding as you came in. It was an open space that, for me, immediately introduces another level of meaning in my life. And so, much though I love show caves, and they're caves, and they're beautiful, and I love them. I love caves. This kind of caving experience introduces you to another degree of meaning. It certainly does for me, anyway.
I think that's one of the things I wanted to kind of discuss a little bit is what it is that compels certain people to go into these spaces. I certainly feel the draw of them, but not in the way that you do. I know that you go weekly. I think I agree with you that some of the most profound or inspiring experiences creatively that I've had have been in cave spaces or underground spaces in the last kind of decade. And something extraordinary about the kind of stillness and sense of being surrounded by a time span well beyond my own, beyond a time span I can imagine, that I find difficult to leave behind. So I understand the compulsion to return, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what it is that you think attracts certain people to these spaces on such a regular basis.
Yeah. I think with these kind of spaces, these dug spaces, it's difficult to know. It's difficult to articulate. I've been trying for a long time, and my work with Flora has really started to crystallise, as it were, kind of general ideas as to why. I mean, I know why I do it. I intuitively know why I do it. I know intuitively why I'm compelled to return again and again. But trying to articulate that compulsion is very difficult. I just got to keep saying, I can't help myself. I'm compelled to go. I'm drawn into it. I always remember as a child on the Clip Peninsula on a family holiday at a beach called Port Fisco on the edge of the peninsula. Beautiful place. And I remember just going for a ramble. I can't remember how old I was. I was young. You know the story. And I walked up the hillside and I came through the vegetation and I found an old mine entrance. Back then, in the early 60s, nobody cared about leaving old mine entrances wide open. There didn't seem to be any health and safety there. So it hadn't been closed off, it was just open. And it was a large gaping hole of darkness with vegetation hanging around it. And it was a magnet. There was a magnetic compulsion. And I remember standing there, and I had no light. And I was being pulled into it. And I've felt that many times since. I don't know what it is. It's not magnetic. But it felt magnetic in that way. And so I think the work with Flora is we've been trying desperately to find a discourse, if you will, a language that can somehow make sense of that compulsion. So, yeah.
That's actually a good time to go towards some of these so amazing. Just flick through some of these. You can always return but these are Fing Hopeless.
I was going to ask next, Frank, about kind of based on that last observation really, about your time spent in bothies. And I know this is something that we've kind of been returning to over and over again. And it's somewhere that you go, you're walking in the Highlands and then you find yourself in these enormous expanses of space. And something about the small bothy environment relates in some way to the idea of what it is that attracts you around about a cave, and this kind of idea of the perimeter in these big open spaces. I know that's something that we've kind of talked about a lot, especially in relation to your work on the translation of Laozi's poetry, which we'll go into a little bit more, but maybe it'd be nice to hear about that relationship between the kind of huge open expanse and the attraction to that, but then the kind of need to return to these small enclosed spaces in the bothies. If that makes sense as a kind of question or set of thoughts or something like that. Yeah. These are the big open spaces. You can see right in the middle there, so there. And then this is more kind of traditional sort of bothy. And then this is the inside of them there. I'm sure many of you know that these are very simple huts or shacks kind of thing in the middle of the Highlands that you can go to without renting them or booking them. There's nothing inside them, there's no running water, electricity. They're sort of like camping but with bricks, I suppose. And they're spaces that you use a lot, especially when you're unable to go caving or
Thank you. I'm sure you must have heard of the Bothies, the Mountain Bothy Association. Do a plug for them, they're fantastic. And what it is a group of people, myself included, who join together and help with funds, with work, with repairs, old shepherds' huts in the Lake District. There's a couple in the Lake District, but mainly in Scotland, in the Scottish Lowlands and in the Scottish Highlands. And they're used as basic shelters. They're open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks of the year, always. They're open, they're free, they're for everybody. Anybody that wants that shelter can have it. And they're maintained by this group of volunteers. But all they are, as Flora said, are shelters. There's no running water, no electricity, there are no facilities. There are just sleeping platforms, and if possible, a fire. You've got to bring, in many cases, your own fuel if you want to light the fire. And that's all they are. Very simple, raw, basic dwelling, shelter in its most simple form. As with caves, there is something about meaning to be had in these. And many of these bothies, I mean, the whole idea of the bothy is that they exist in a wild, open space, miles from anywhere. You can't drive to them, you've got to walk to them. You've got to carry your sleeping bag, your food, etc. to them. And these are, for me, special places because they take you back to an experience, as it were. Take you right back to what it is to dwell in basic simplicity. There's nothing to interrupt your thought. And if you want to go and write something, this is a great place to do it.
So I actually nearly interrupted your thought. As you said, there's nothing to interrupt your thought then. Sorry. Sorry. I wanted to kind of think about those spaces. One of the things we've been trying to get to the bottom of a lot in our conversations is the paradoxical nature of the cave. And there's a really fantastic writer called Monica Dadadora. I'm happy to leave these books out for anyone who's interested in them. Who's written a book about the Byzantine landscape. And she's written about the cave in a section of that. And one of the things she articulates so beautifully is the idea that this cave can be all of these different things at once, all of these different states at once, and it's a completely confusing space as a result. And I think the bothy kind of sits in that space as well. It's both a shelter as well as something quite nerve-wracking, or a lot of people find fearful. There's something that she's written here. The small empty space of the cave is suddenly filled with the uncontainable and the unspeakable. And that's what she describes as the cave becomes dark as you turn the light out. A very narrow, enclosed gap can suddenly become vast because of that profound darkness. And those kind of ideas of edge and perimeter that felt so distinct and solid a moment ago, these ancient rocks around you, suddenly completely disappear and you feel as though you're in outer space suddenly. So the idea that these sort of things are both a container but also kind of those edges can be porous and that you can suddenly feel you're floating in these massive spaces. It's something that keeps reoccurring as a problem. And I suppose that's one of the things I find so compelling conceptually about these spaces is that you can't ever really get to the bottom of them and they're ungraspable in that way. In Frank's recent, we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but Frank and his wife Feixia and Xiaomin, a friend of theirs, have recently translated Laozi's prose poetry. And there's a section in section 55, a little the clay is baked into earthenware, the emptiness in the middle makes the earthenware useful. And that is something that I kind of think about in relation to these spaces a lot, in that they have the outer edge in some way, but also the inner edge, and they're both of those things simultaneously. I'm not exactly sure if it's in the order of how we kind of put things, but maybe it would be a nice time to talk about this a little bit more. I can say that this translation of the Laozi poetry has been done with Feixia, UK Director of the Confucius Institute at the University of Central Lancashire, lecturer in Chinese, Asia-Pacific Studies and Translation Studies, and Xiaomin, Professor of Engineering and Down Studies at Tsinghua University in Beijing. And Feixia is your wife, Frank, and you've translated this with her over a number of years? Would you say? 1 year. And I just wonder if you could speak a little bit about this translation process and your caving and how those, and your experiences in the bothies, and maybe how some of those thoughts become integrated or how they influence each other, if that makes some sense.
The Tao Te Ching is the general term for this book by Laozi. We assume it was Laozi, 2,500 years ago. So classical Chinese, originally written on bamboo slats, very difficult, to translate. Been translated, I think it's the most translated Chinese text in existence. So we thought we had to do another one. It can never be enough. But Xiaomin, Lian Xiaomin, our colleague, sent out a message around the internet. He wanted a husband and wife team, ideally, 2 people who work together. Somebody who spoke classical Chinese, or read classical Chinese, and was fluent in Chinese, and understood Taoism and classical Chinese culture. Was also married to a person who was a native English speaker, was a linguist, who was also interested in Taoist classical Chinese culture. And it just so happened my wife and I had been married for 32 years. We were both fascinated by classical Chinese and English, and we were both fascinated by the Tao Te Ching, Laozi, classical Chinese poetry, and so on. So the 3 of us got together almost within a week of the message going out, and over a year we translated the Tao Te Ching into English. Slightly different version of the Tao Te Ching that you'll see through most translations in English now. And it was the Ma Wang Dui text, which had things in a different order. So that's, well, we didn't call it the Tao Te Ching, it is the Tao Te Ching. You could call it the De Tao Ching because it's slightly twisted around. But this, I've been studying Chinese for 30 odd years. However much I studied our children are bilingual, their Chinese is fluent and mine is still rubbish. So it's one of those things, they've been speaking Chinese in a shorter time than I've been studying. They're still far better. But one of the things it did for me was to open up another channel of thinking and aesthetics in cave thought. Simply because the Tao Te Ching talks about emptiness, about shapelessness. And the more I studied the Tao Te Ching, the more I studied the language and the poetry associated with it from the 4th century in China. I then got introduced, I mean, I'd known about it before, but I hadn't followed it to the same degree. The mountains and rivers tradition of about the 3rd or 4th century China. Shanshui Shi, mountains and streams, poetry, or Shanshui Hua, mountains and streams, painting. And the 3rd or 4th century, to come out with an aesthetic as subtle and as detailed and as brilliant as this, just blew my mind. But the idea of the interrelation through yin and yang of mountains and rivers in a perpetual, not as binary opposites, but as a perpetual dynamic interrelation, in a way opened up the cave. And what is a cave if not formed by water in a mountain? Water forms the cave. What fills the cave up? Water. The pictures we saw before of the calcite, the porous rock and the water pouring in. Water brings in sediments, water brings in calcite, fills the cave up again. Water comes on another wave, opens the cave again. Calcite comes in, water, sediment is brought in, fills the cave up again. Water comes in, washes away the sediment, breaks up the calcite, opens the cave again. So the cave that we found last year, you could see the wave after wave after wave of sediment washing in, washing out, washing in, washing out. False floors of calcite, 30 meters above the ground. Filled up the calcite floor, then all washed away again. Then filled up again, then washed away again. Layer after layer. And for me, Xiaomin, Taoqian, Laozi, Zhuangzi, these great, fantastic, I love them, these fantastic thinkers, 2,000 years ago, they were expressing this. They were telling me, right, this is how it's done. Look at it this way. Absence giving way to presence. Presence giving way to absence. And so on and so forth, relentlessly. As Du Fu, the great poet, said, towns and cities come and go, but mountains and rivers are without end.
But
Evangelicals.
you said in your article about this recent discovery about Fing Hopeless that it is a shape-shifting cave. Once you find what you think to be a defining passage, it metamorphoses into something different. So that's obviously kind of in your thinking at all times. I'm going to talk really briefly, we've kind of gone past that, I'm going to talk really briefly from this kind of idea of the absolutely ancient. I'm going to talk really briefly about the artificial cave that I rented as part of a project. Only because it kind of, in a way, is almost the exact opposite of the caves that Frank's been showing us. The artificial cave is something you can hire from the British Caving Association. It's a fiberglass set of tubes that are kind of modular, and you put them all together, bolt them all together in different ways. And I got a little bit of funding, and I did about 3 days of workshops. One was with a group of artists, about 12 artists and geographers and various people that I come across in my discussions. This is quite a while ago, it's probably about 10 years ago now, maybe not that. And I asked them to come to the Mendips to go caving, to spend a day looking at cave maps, and then finally to spend a day working with this artificial cave. And the idea of this cave, I think, this artificial cave, is to encourage young people or people who maybe wouldn't necessarily have a go at caving, maybe because it's a little bit nerve-wracking to actually go down into the earth, to have a go at it and see that actually the spaces that look really tiny are actually quite open and you can fit through them if you just move. And so I invited some people to come along, including a geographer called James Irvin, an artist called Daniel Clark, an artist called Shanice Aretha, Fing Hopeless Pot, Beth Collar, Francesco Pedraglio, a geographer called Harriet Hawkins, my partner Johnny Hemsbury, publican, and my little girl Marina, who around the time was about 4. And together we sort of shoveled this thing together and then tried to move through it. And the inside of it, you can see here, is a fiberglass kind of spray painted number. And it's really quite difficult to move through, but it's in such deep contrast in some ways to the cave you were describing, and it makes me, when you were moving through it, you felt perhaps a bit self-conscious. The temperature of the thing was quite warm, I suppose. It was definitely dry. It had a kind of echo when you knocked on it. It definitely sounded, synthetic, I suppose. And it made me think a lot about, Frank, the piece that you wrote around aesthetics and kind of wonder, and where that kind of sense of wonder comes from. Whether it's something that you can imagine, whether it's something that you can recreate. And as an artist, obviously, that's something I'm always trying to think about, whether it's worth trying to recreate these spaces. What happens when you try and recreate them? Do you do them justice? Can you do them justice? And then the very kind of ancient spaces that you're describing that are 25,000 years old for a little formation this size and millions of years old around you. And it makes me think a lot about different types of imaginary formations, and perhaps some of the formations that you've described to me I've never visited, but I have somehow got a gap for them in my mind. And I just wonder if you think that a space that's a sort of an unauthentic cave space can have any of the kind of wonder of the cave, of the ancient cave, or whether it is inherently part of a more, whether those formations are particularly because of the depth and age of them.
I think that's a great question, Flora. I think for me, as Flora was just saying there, that these are tests and they're interesting constructions of a cave. But as Flora has already pointed out, as Flora asked me to talk about, was the idea of the bothy. And I'm obsessed with bothies as well as caves. Not that bothies are underground, they're there, but it is that space. I mean, Bachelard, I'm sure we're familiar with Gaston Bachelard's Poetics of Space. And for me, that he focuses on the house. And I was really quite interested if we sort of took that Poetics of Space approach and looked at the bothy. And what is it about the bothy, the space of the bothy, the space of that shelter, that small shelter. And in many cases, there's no cellar. Sometimes there are lofts. What I loved about Bachelard's description, about whatever you see moving in a cellar, it moves more slowly than what moves in the attic. I thought that was a great kind of Gothic line there. But bothies, there are no cellars, it's just one level. But there is something about the poetics of the bothy. It's not just a room. The bothies have histories. There used to be shepherds' cottages, for example, and no longer. So there are lives and a history of lives in there. There was one bothy in the south of Scotland, in the Ettrick Valley, and it's the only bothy owned by the Mountain Bothy Association. Over Powhock, a fantastic name. But it was there that the grandparents of James Hogg, the Ettrick shepherd, and the poet of the 1820s, used to live. Hogg just lived in a house further down. So when I'm going there, Hogg famously wrote the Confessions and Memoirs of a Justified Sinner. This was an early kind of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde character being pursued. But I always think about Hogg when I stay in that bothy. That bothy has history. It's incredible. So, in many ways, those spaces, I feel, it's the meaning that they give to you, and it's your experience. It could be underground, it could be very deep underground, it could be very shallow, it could be a house. It's that space. I'm fascinated, as I'm sure you all are, of course, while we're here, with this idea of space and place. And what is it that attracts us to it?
I think part of what was so interesting about this project with other people interested in caves, I was going to say other artists, but it was a mixed group, interdisciplinary group, was that even though this cave had a sort of it was inauthentic in lots of ways, it did other things that I thought were really fascinating. Like you could suddenly conjure a kind of perimeter. So from lots of little bits of ring, you could put them all together and make something that had an inside and an outside that could appear in front of you. It was also really interesting working with artists some of whom were more interested in movement and choreography than me, and thinking about the movement and how they negotiated that space was really interesting, because I think the underground spaces and probably this artificial cave, which became this kind of knotted thing here that helped me understand and think through the project, was that I think those spaces demand particular kinds of movement that very few others, that I've experienced anyway, ask of you. They ask you to move your body in ways that feel very unfamiliar. But there was a definite kind of lack of wonder about this artificial cave in some ways. And I think it is about that it was not imbued with meaning in the way that you're describing the bothy and the real caves as well. We've got two more sites that we want to discuss. One of them I've never been to, and so this idea of authenticity comes up a lot for me in this work, because I feel maybe I can't really make work about it because I've never been there. But I'm thinking about that a lot. I'm thinking about how these caves occupy our imagination, and how maybe my experiences of just hearing you speak about it can be, that have a value in themselves, I think. So we're going to move on to Mulu, which is an incredible place in Borneo that Frank has been part of an expedition for many years now, it's an extraordinary, is it the biggest cave network? The biggest cave chamber in the world is in Mulu.
With Sarawak, main chamber.
Sarawak, yeah.
It's one of the biggest, longest cave systems in the world.
And what you were just saying there about the kind of mountains and valleys, these photographs that you sent me, of the kind of, just to give you a bit of a sense of the landscape and the scale of the place, just feels so, certainly so extraordinary to me, certainly something I've never experienced personally, is a landscape of that scale, I would say. Could you tell us a little bit more about these sites?
Yes. Mulu is in Borneo, northern Borneo. It's close to it's in Sarawak, part of the Federation of Malaysia. It's very close to the Brunei border. If you look at this picture, Brunei is just over the way there, just off the picture. It's a national park. It's largely made of limestone. There is sandstone there. And under Gunung Api and Gunung Mulu, the mountain chain there are about 240 kilometres of cave passage, but they're all on a series of levels. So again, it's not one single passage. So it's very long, and it has numerous entrances. But the pictures Flora has just shown, to find the entrances, you have to search the forest. And so the group that we have the expedition with is a blend of, well, world cavers. There are American cavers, European cavers, Asian cavers. But we do the cave, obviously, with the Malaysian cavers and Sarawak forestry. So these are forest camps that the Sarawak foresters and the local people who work with us and come caving with us, the Penang. So the Penang people who live in the forest, they would make these camp shelters. And what used to amaze me was to watch them do it. They would use a parang or machete, and they would never use nails, no hammers, and they would create shelters entirely with a parang. Everything was bound with twine, and bamboo or wood would be cut, fixed, and bound. And they could knock one of these up in an hour or two. They're absolutely astonishing. But we leave these bases to go searching the mountains for caves. And these would be the size of the caves we would find. This is called Racer Cave. These photographs, the big ones, were taken by Mark Berkey. I must hasten to add, fantastic, tremendous cave photography. But that's me, so I didn't take a photograph. But you can see the scale of the cave systems and the roofs. And they're very white limestone, very different limestone to that we find in Yorkshire. See, Deer Cave. You'll have seen this cave on the David Attenborough documentaries, where there are bats. There were 4 million bats in the roof. And at about 6 o'clock each evening, they fly out and go looking for food over the top of the forest. So after the warmth of the day, the insects have been rising and the bats will go out. But when you see the bats go out, they don't all go out at once, they go out in groups. And they go in pulses and spirals and twists and turns, create the most amazing shapes. Millions, 4 million of them, go out in an evening and then come back. And this is in Deer Cave. Now this is a Clearwater Cave. You can see that they're not streams, they're river caves, so of enormous size.
When you go into these caves, you go in as a team? It's quite a serious amount of equipment.
Yeah.
team includes a medic. I mean, there's quite a serious amount of training and thought that goes into these expeditions. And you're on the ground for a number of weeks at a time, is that right?
Or days.
Days,
Yeah. It's how much you can carry,
Yeah.
how much food you can carry. We can carry enough food for maybe 3 or 4 days at the camp underground. But medics, we just have, sometimes we're lucky to have a doctor with us, a medical doctor. On one expedition I went, and I had to do the medical stuff. And though I'm a doctor of literature, and not of medicine. So the rest of the cavers said, well, if nothing else, Frank, you can write us a good epitaph on our gravestone. Give them a good eulogy. I'll give them a good speech. Send me along.
And the purpose of the expeditions is to connect and map this huge network.
Yeah.
Which I find, I don't know about you, but I find so hard to kind of piece this thing together and to imagine the scale of it. Because it's, how many kilometres of cave? You already said that, sorry.
Well, I mean, on a normal expedition, you could get maybe 7 or 8 kilometres of new cave that you could find. So the idea of the cave for Sarawak Forestry and for the National Park, all of these caves would have to be surveyed. So I go in there with that intuitive love of space. But a lot of the guys I go in there with, they go in with an intuitive love of numbers. And they go in there with your compass, your clinometer to measure the height and so on. But also your measuring stick, your laser. And the laser measures the distance. Builders, surveyors, architects use them when they build houses. So laser surveying for measuring is very advanced now. You do it in 3 dimensions. But a lot of these survey discos, they're called, incorporate the compass and the clinometer. So you can point your laser and it will give you the compass bearing, the angle, and the distance all in one.
I find when I'm trying to imagine the spaces that you're describing, I kind of, I think it's because I'm much less knowledgeable than you about these spaces, but I find it hard to make distinctions. And I know we've discussed before dreaming in caves, because I'm quite fascinated by the idea of there being camps, which we'll come to in a minute, a couple of pictures of the camps, and you guys sleeping in there, and thinking in there, and talking in there, and measuring in there, about whether these caves in your mind become merged, whether you dream about them, whether they feel distinct and the mapping kind of stays quite clear, or whether they become a little bit less clear, a little bit blurred in your imagination.
I think I've found if I go into a cave and I'm dreaming about something else, I can't remember where I am. But if I go into these caves and I look and take things in with my peripheral vision as well as main vision, I'm amazed how much I remember. And so I can go in long distances and find my way back out. And this cave and this camp is in a place called Scum Ring. Not a very pleasant name, but it's in the centre of the clear water system. And it was called Scum Ring because birds, the little swiftlets, find their way into the cave through echolocation, and they nest in the roof. They create the nests that people have with bird's nest soup, if you're interested in bird's nest soup. I'm not, but the birds there, and they live in the ceiling, way above you. So their feathers and their guano rain down. And this particular large chamber was called Scum Ring because right around the edge of it, there was always a tide mark of birds' feathers and guano all the way around this size of this room here. And nobody had ever seen the flood that raised the water. There was no water there. When we went there, there's a trickle. This hole here is normally an empty hole with a little trickle of water where we gather our water. So nobody had ever been there to see the tide coming. And we were there one night, one January, woken up by the roar of water. And looking up at the roof, there was a column coming down, crashing down onto a ledge above and pouring into the hole. That, the back is normally a dry passage. That was surging. So we knew that on the surface there was a storm. And it had found its way through all the layers and the labyrinths of Mulu and was passing through. It would pass through here. We were quite high, so it would drain away. But we experienced the flood. The tide came in and created the ring around. And we spent the night on a heap of guano. Not as comfortable as it sounds.
So aware of our time as well, Peter.
Yeah.
So these are some pictures of the camp and where they all stay. Your son goes with you as well.
That's my
I think.
son,
Oh, there's
yeah.
as well there. Yeah. We're gonna finish with a really recent trip to. I think we've got about sort of 5 to 10 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes there. A recent trip to Weathercoat Cave, which is in it's in Yorkshire, it's North Yorkshire, isn't it? It's right on the edge, isn't it? But
It's
yeah,
Yorkshire.
it is Yorkshire. Yeah, it's in Yorkshire. But it's on the Lancashire border. And here is me with Lian and Emma. Diane's an incredible caver, and Emma is a cave diver, and I'm neither of those things. But we went together with Frank and another group of people to this cave, Weathercoat Cave. And we just wanted to finish with this because it's a cave that we've been talking about a lot recently. I'm so interested in it because it's a vertical cave, so essentially it's a waterfall, a kind of plummet down to a waterfall. I found out recently that it's actually only in the 70s being closed off, and that was because there was an accident there. So you have to ask permission to get the key to go in, and that's been done for safety rather than anything else. I've been completely taken with this idea of this cave, and part of that is, well, so have many people. Many of the poets that Frank's interested in, Turner made lots of drawings of this cave as well. But one of the things you can see a painting by Turner from 1822, I think. This is one of Frank's photographs of the cave today. But the idea that I've been so taken with, that speaks so much to many of our conversations, is this idea that there's this vertical passageway, essentially, that's got a waterfall going into it, which is really spectacular in itself. But very quickly, another waterfall from the top can come in and completely flood the whole channel, the whole vertical space, including the waterfall within it, making that an underwater waterfall, essentially, kind of thing. Something like that. I'm trying to get my head around it at the moment. But this has been our most recent visit. My little boy came to, and I'm sure my son Ralph came to. This is Frank's daughter. That's Hannah, isn't it?
Hannah, yeah.
Hannah's daughter, Yinka, will also be there soon. She's only, how old now? 1, so we'll give her a couple of years, and then she'll be there. But this is Hannah at the waterfalls. And you can see in this photograph, I think that's Diane, but just behind the kind of the lower waterfall.
Yeah.
And it's really rapid, it's incredible, it's such an extraordinary place to be, isn't it? You feel the immense power in this vertical cave. And in there, you can go in under the waterfall, in through, and then a passage has fairly recently been understood to come out underground, and it's been dived. They've explored it with diving equipment, and it comes out just up the way there, a few hundred meters out, isn't it? It comes out here. So I suppose that stretch is a few hundred meters from the bottom of the waterfall out through this hole here. And Emma, who on this trip with, has done that dive.
Yes, Emma has.
Emma has. Okay. So this, and part of the reason I find this little bit of kind of network so fascinating is because, and I know it's you introduced me to it, it's fascinating to you, is because it's so timeless, and its extraordinary nature is so timeless, and we have found it compelling every time we visited it. But then, so have Wordsworth, so have all of those Because I don't know if you would tell us a little bit about your relationship with this cave network.
Yeah. See if
I can find them. That's going into the final cave, and that's from the inside. That's my son getting shoved through, back out again.
Yeah. Yes, this is something I spent a good part of my life looking at. One of the things I was fascinated by was the way caving had developed and the way the imagination of caves had developed over time. And we'd gone from a period where we mined caves. Even though there were records of miners leaving ideas and descriptions of their caves, invariably these were few and far between. As is often the case, the miners were overlooked. So what you started to get was probably around the 17th, early 18th century, invariably priests, strangely enough, and vicars, and so on. They obviously didn't work very much because they had the time, they had the money, they could go on holidays. So all of our, not all, but most of our early descriptions of caves for pleasure, not for mining, but for pleasure, were largely recorded in so many instances, not all, but many, by vicars and curates and so on. But by the end of the 18th century, holidays had started to appear, the roads were getting better, the hotels were getting better. And so farmers, local people, set up tours of caves. It's tended to tie in with people's tour of Britain. And if you think about a great classical text like Aeneas and his journey, Odyssey, with Odysseus, Ulysses, many of these classical journeys became kind of mini holidays. And so people would go on their Odyssey around Britain. But as with Odysseus and as with Aeneas, they'd have to go underground. They'd have to go into the underworld at some point. And so they focused on, well, you've got to come here and go into the underworld in Yorkshire. And one of the first great cave journeys was not just Yordas Cave in Kingstown, but it was Weathercoat. And I know from reading the letters and the diaries that when Dorothy Wordsworth began her Grasmere journal, it was done on the day that William and John, her two brothers, went to Yordas and Weathercoat to go down. So my argument would be that Dorothy's Grasmere journals were one of the first descent narratives that we had. But one of the things, Wordsworth went back there several times. And by 1805, when he did the first writing of the Prelude, he described the creative imagination. Very close to the subconscious and so on. Another 100 years before Freud's interpretation of dreams and so on. So it would be somewhat anachronistic to talk about it as a poem about the unconscious. But there was something going on here. And once you read the passage that Wordsworth states, he never said it was Weathercoat. My argument is, it is Weathercoat, simply because I've been there so many times and I recognise it. And the line he writes here in Book 13 of the Prelude, this faculty, the imagination, hath been the moving soul of our long labour. We have traced the stream from darkness and the very place of birth in its blind cavern, Gatecote Cave, whence is faintly heard the sound of waters, followed it to light, an open day, accompanied its course among the ways of nature, afterwards lost sight of it, bewildered and engulfed. Weathercote Cave, Hurtle Cave, Joint Cave, sinks and sinks, rises, sinks. And then giving it greeting as it rose once again, with strength reflecting its solemn breast, the works of man and the face of human life. So if you follow Weathercoat, it's the most incredible cave system that comes out, because it's in cast limestone, the water sinks into the limestone. It then rises in places like Weathercoat and then sinks again. Rises in joint and then sinks again. rises in her fall, and then sinks. And as Flora mentioned before, Emma, who you saw on the bench with dive, have dived. It's a cave dive. We can't do it. You've got to be a diver. And they've dived it in its full length. And it comes out of God's Bridge, interestingly, as the River Greta in Chapley Down. So it's an absolutely fascinating system. It's super, but I will argue that it is metaphorically, obviously, it doesn't have to be geographically determinate, it could be anywhere. But I would argue that Wordsworth got his inspiration from Weathercoat.
Oh, that's it. We're going to finish. Hopefully, this has been giving you a bit of a sense of how our conversations evolve and how these sort of spaces live in our memories. For Frank, memories occasionally for me, but also in my imagination, and also in the imagination of lots of the poets and artists that inspire us. I wanted to finish. This is an image of something in the studio I'm making in response to Weathercoat Cave and the Waterfall, and the journeys that I've been